You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Campus Podcast with me, Miranda Prynne.
And with me, Eliza Compton.
So here in the UK, we've welcomed in a new Labour government after 14 years of Conservative rule, albeit with a coalition for 5 years of that. And this comes at a time of crisis for UK higher education. We've seen frozen tuition fees throughout a period of very high inflation. There have been falling numbers of international students, which do still subsidise this system. And there is now a lot of talk around the very real possibility of a university going bankrupt. Alongside this, though, we also have students themselves facing ever greater financial strain because student maintenance support has also fallen sharply in real terms due to inflation. So there's a lot going on here, and thankfully the last government did actually place a lot of importance in research and development funding, even while they were making cuts elsewhere. But the other thing to say, which is often overlooked now, even though it's comparatively recent, the huge strain that COVID put on the sector. There's been so much that's happened since in kind of global events that it's almost like everyone's forgotten that COVID demanded a total overhaul of the higher education system and all the additional financial and staff resource that incurred at a time of falling funding. So I hate to sound gloomy, but there is an awful lot that needs addressing, and it really needs addressing fast. I guess on that basis, we're all desperately hoping this new government can offer some reasons for optimism. Eliza, what are your thoughts on this?
Well, the overall election result was not a surprise. There was a general feeling in the run-up that Labor was going to win. I think perhaps they didn't expect quite so big a majority. It seems like the reaction from the sector has been one of relief, perhaps, and also an opportunity to reset the relationship between the government and the higher education sector, to perhaps work together a bit more closely as a partnership to address some of these deep issues that we've been hearing so much about. So I think there is broad positivity about what this Parliament might bring.
Yeah, and as both our interviews will go on to show, that point you make about a feeling of maybe cautious positivity. I mean, while it would be unfair to brand the previous 14 years as being some sort of attack on higher education, because it absolutely wasn't, and there's always been collaboration between the sector and government. These last few years, there has undoubtedly been a lot of negative rhetoric about our higher education system, and you can almost feel and hear the frustration coming from those in the sector kind of saying, but hang on, we're part of the solution, we can offer so much. So I think for them, this must offer maybe an avenue by which they see a potential sea change and the ability to really offer their services where they are welcome.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think stability is a bit of a key theme as well. It certainly was in my interview that I did for this episode with Vivienne Stern. She's the Chief Executive of Universities UK, which is the umbrella body that represents 142 universities to influence policy and opinion, provide insight into the sector, and a platform for collective action. She's got decades of HE policy, so is able to take a kind of longer term view of where, I guess, the incoming government might sit in broader terms. And she did talk quite a lot in our interview about stabilising the sector, both in terms of funding but also in the landscape for research and development. But to start off, I was quite keen to ask her how the sector was going to make the most of this moment in the wake of the election.
Great, let's hear from Vivienne.
Hi Vivienne, and welcome to the THE podcast.
Hi.
It's great to have you talking to us today. So my first question is, How can universities make the most of this early opportunity to influence how Labor fills out its policies around higher education? We haven't had so much detail yet, so I wondered perhaps if this was a chance for universities to make their mark or have an influence early on.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, first of all, I think this is a very rare moment in politics where you get a kind of transition of political power from one party to another. And although, we should have worked out by now that politics has become a massively unstable thing, but nonetheless, with a majority of this size, there's a Labour Party, I think, that might be thinking about not just one term, but possibly more than one term in government. And we'll have the sort of parliamentary numbers to do things that might otherwise be very difficult. So, it's a very, very rare set of circumstances which give you the opportunity to think a bit longer term than we normally do. And that we shouldn't miss. I also think, from our point of view, you never get a second chance to make a first impression. It's critical that the university sector uses this moment to try to achieve a bit of a reset in our relationship with government. And I think for me, fundamental to that is listening to what Keir Starmer has been saying about the values that he expects to drive the incoming government. And he keeps saying country first and party second. And my view is that we also just need to listen very hard to that. I think that the kind of in part of the reset of relationship, we need to be very clear that as a sector, we're not going to go to government with all of our problems. We're going to think about the way that we can contribute to the kind of national challenges we face, particularly growth and opportunity, and think about institutional interest, perhaps a little less than thinking about national interest. And that, I think, should shape the way we try to use this particular moment.
Do you have a sense about what Labor's priorities might be?
All the plans you make before government will kind of, make contact with the reality of being in government. So I imagine all of that will, throw a succession of interesting curveballs into the mix. But Labour, in the run up to the election, on one hand, it was very sort of detailed light. The manifesto was absent some really quite significant bits of detail you might have expected to set. But on the other hand, if you look at the Labour missions, I think the Labour Party's been saying for quite a while what it thinks the priorities should be, and it set out some reasonably high level statements of intent around these 5 missions. For us, I think the opportunity mission is really central and the growth mission is really central, but there are others. So, for example, the public service mission, which is largely but not only about the NHS, that should be part of our thinking. And I also think, the university sector has a huge stake in green growth and in the transition to a low carbon economy. So I think in those sort of macro political terms, it's reasonably clear at least what the high level ambitions would be. In our sector, there's been a bit of discussion about higher education. The glib way of answering your question would be to say higher education itself isn't particularly a priority. I think Bridget Phillipson's going to go into DFE thinking a lot about early years in schools. There's an awareness of the financial fragility of the university sector, and I think that's quite important. But beyond that, I think there are lots of unanswered questions about how the new government will see universities as actors in pursuing the missions that they're setting about pursuing. The good thing from our point of view is that in a lot of the statements made by shadow ministers before the election, in the election period itself, in the manifesto, and since the government formed, there have been lots of indications that this government will think of universities as a really important agent and contributor towards some of the national goals that they've set themselves. And that, I think, is going to feel like a bit of a breath of fresh air, because under the previous government, we were locked in a kind of relationship where it felt a bit like we were a kind of permanent problem. And, perhaps a little bit of a sense of political opportunity to win some favour with parts of the electorate by giving the university sector a whack around the back of the head. And I just hope that will all stop now and we can get on with the really serious business of making the most of the sector as a kind of catalyst for things that we might want to achieve as a nation.
So you see Labor perhaps working a bit more closely with higher education than under the Conservatives, where, as you say, there seemed to be a level of, I don't know, animosity might be a bit of a strong word to use, but certainly a distance.
Yeah, there was. I mean, to be fair to the last government, it was never really true that, the whole of government hated the whole of the university sector. We saw a pretty incredible commitment to investment in research and development over the course of the last period of successive Conservative and coalition governments. There was a commitment to continue investing in research, even when other things were being squeezed. And even on the higher education side, successive Conservative governments took some risks in order to make sure that the university sector was adequately funded by doing things like increasing the tuition fee in 2010. But certainly lately, it got to be, we got into a trap where I really felt that, every time we had a conversation with some ministers, it was really about what we'd done wrong this week. And that was quite depressing and frustrating when you could see that there were really big issues that we needed to grapple with.
Yes. Well, speaking of difficult, I think in February you called on the next government to make some quick, tough decisions around university funding, which you've mentioned, particularly around unfreezing tuition fees. Do you think this is going to be a priority, given the focus on the instability of some institutions in the UK and the threat to their viability?
Look, I think it's really important that we get significant political attention. The argument that I've been making is you can deal with this one of two ways. You can either say, look, I've got bigger fish to fry, I've got plenty of problems, thank you very much, take your problem off my desk and we'll get back to it when we've got bandwidth. And if you do that, I think there is a reasonable possibility that the fragility of a number of institutions will come to a head, and that in fact government ends up with a set of really messy sort of circumstances unfolding in the early months of their leadership, and that they then spend a lot of time trying to put the genie back in the box. I mean, if a big institution were to fail, and I really hope that that is not what is going to happen, but if a big university really were seriously to kind of go over the parapet into whatever insolvency looks like in our sector, you would spend months and months and a lot of money trying to solve all of the kind of consequences of that. So you think about, the previous government seemed to think that the only real issue would be finding places for students to study. And that's the half of it. If you've got the second biggest employer in a town or a city, it's providing the public sector workforce, it's a unique part of the kind of economic infrastructure of a region, you would be dealing with a colossal nest of problems. So I mean, what I've been really saying is that you don't have the luxury of putting this in the box, which says come back to it in a year. You probably do want to do that with a whole bunch of the kind of really fundamental questions about the higher education and research system. Fine, you may want to commission a review and you may want to take your time in thinking about that, but you're going to have to stabilize the ship to buy yourself the time for the big hard think. And I think stabilizing the ship means making sure there's a backstop mechanism in case institutions do really get to that danger point to stop something messy happening. I think you have to settle the international market. We've seen huge volatility, and that's one of the biggest reasons why we've got such kind of fragile institutions in the UK. So settling the market by being really clear that there is going to be stability in university visa, in international visa policy. And I think the third thing is very fast. The government should link both the maintenance funding available to students while they study and the fee in England to inflation. They need to link those two things to inflation simultaneously. Not because that's an overnight fix, but because it will calm everybody's nerves. They'll see, okay, we may not have a complete solution, but we've got a direction of travel which feels like not the slow sort of descent into disaster. That seems to me very important.
Yeah, because at the moment it does seem that on the one hand you have universities faced with frozen tuition fees and the problems that come with that, but at the same time, increasing tuition fees then leans on students who are also facing the cost of living crisis. It seems like the sector is being pulled from every direction.
That way, because I think that, you know, when you talk about students and the cost of living pressures, that's really about the maintenance support that they have to live on while they're studying. And I would argue, whatever government does, they should make sure that that maintenance loan is linked to inflation, so it doesn't continue to erode over time. Actually, I'd like them to go further and make grants available for the students from the poorest backgrounds, because at the moment, you know, we've got this ironic situation where those are the students with the least sort of wealthy backgrounds are the ones that emerge with the largest amount of debt, and that can't be right. But on the fee side, you know, I'm not suggesting that an incoming government should put the fees up. What I'm suggesting is that they should stop them going down year after year after year. And I think those two things are quite different. Now, in terms of a kind of longer term solution to the funding challenges, personally, I believe that the system is now a little bit out of balance. And that if you want to restore the kind of lost funding for the education that universities are able to offer students, it shouldn't come from graduates through the fee. It should be an increase in public funding. But I recognise that, you know, going to government at this point and asking for a big injection of public funding is really difficult. So that's why I'm saying just make a first start, steady the ship, inflation link both the maintenance support for students whilst they're studying and the fee to stop that going down and down and down. At least then a university trying to balance its books knows that it's not chasing a moving target in which its income position is just going to get steadily worse over time.
So the need, obviously, for the incoming government is to really talk to the sector, talk around the sector for advice around policy. Where do you think Labor is likely to turn for this kind of advice? Where are the good ideas coming from?
Well, I mean, you know, it's a very good question. I mean, I think, first of all, there are lots of people on the front bench who are very knowledgeable, engaged when it comes to higher education policy. Our new higher education minister, I don't know whether Jackie Smith's brief has been confirmed, but we're expecting her to be the higher education minister, has done previous stints in the Department for Education. David Lammy, the foreign secretary, was a previous higher education minister. We've got, you know, people who've got good, strong backgrounds in student politics. I mean, Wes Streeting, with whom I cut my teeth as a kind of junior, policy wonk when he was president of the NUS. You know, he understands universities. And then there's a whole bunch of people around the Labour team who are deeply thoughtful, you know, have been wrestling with some of the problems that an incoming government will face. We ourselves are trying to do that. We've got a process. We're trying to have a go at a sort of what we think of as a kind of shadow white paper. So we know government might commission a review or might think about something like a white paper process. And rather than waiting for them to ask us to start thinking about some big questions, we thought we should have a go at asking ourselves those questions in advance and start testing, okay, what do we think this sector needs in order to be, you know, the best possible contributor to national prosperity in a decade's time? How can we make sure that in 10 years' time we look back and we think, okay, we made the system better because of a bunch of things we did? And that's what the white paper process is about.
And on the subject of funding, there's the sense of universities themselves being viable, the sector being viable, but the other large, I guess, aspect of the sector's activity is research and development. As you said, funding for research did increase significantly under Conservatives, and Labor is now proposing longer terms for R&D funding. How important is this in terms of the stabilisation that you're talking about?
So we have argued for longer term funding cycles. I think the thing that has sort of dawned on us in the recent months is that you can talk about long-term funding cycles and be very kind of pleased to see that language being reflected back by the Labour Party in the run-up to the election and now the government. But the devil's a little bit in the details. So you have to think, okay, do you think what that means is the same thing as we think what that means? And that's where we're kind of getting to now. So what would be a good thing is the sort of stable funding programme approach that we have seen in previous periods under Labour governments. And also, you know, you can look at things like Horizon Europe as a model, where you've got a 7-year programme, the budget is set in advance, and work plans are published, so you know what's going to happen and you can plan for it. And that means you can, if you're in a research team, you can say, look, I'd like to be able to compete for a big grant in 2 years' time. What's the team I need to put together? How will I put together a really compelling application? And you can do that because you know that call will come. The UK, it hasn't been like that. It's been much more unstable. And funding vehicles arrive and then they disappear, and people get all geared up to do one thing and then it changes. And so we're talking about stability and predictability. What we're not talking about is locking up large amounts of funding in individual grants, or to direct funding towards individual institutes or teams for very, very long periods, because that, in a sense, could end up removing the flexibility that the research councils have to fund the best ideas as they emerge. So that's the devil's in the detail there, I think. I'd also say we need to start a bit more of a debate about QR, so the quality-related funding that you get in the UK system. This is absolutely essential to the way that the UK system works. And my view is that that sort of fundamental keep the lights on, the kind of funding that allows universities to prime new projects, to develop new areas of brilliant expertise, that's been eroded a little bit over time, and we need to start talking about bumping that up a little bit, at least keeping pace with inflation. The reason I think it's particularly important is that as universities have lost funding through international student fees, as those numbers have gone down in the last year, that erodes the funding universities themselves are able to put into research. And we should never forget, and we should never let a government forget, that the second biggest funder of research in the UK is the university sector itself. 5.6 billion a year. It's colossal, and we don't make nearly enough fuss about that.
What do you think about the balance between research that is more commercially, or obviously commercially driven? I don't know if I'm going to phrase this correctly, sort of about knowledge transfer, getting ideas, commercialising them, and seeing the returns from that, versus research that's more blue sky, that's more looking out in a much, much longer term than getting immediate commercial or financial returns on that investment?
Yeah, so my prediction is that we spend a lot of the next year talking about, the word tilt is going to come up a lot in the next year. And I think there'll be a lot of sort of discussion going on in government in DCIT about kind of how you balance funding between different sorts of vehicle. Should there be more funding going in towards kind of, the applied end of the spectrum? I mean, my view is that you have to maintain a balance. The things that become today's absolutely economically enormous opportunities, AI, the way that quantum technologies and quantum computing will revolutionize a whole bunch of sectors. That was fundamental blue skies research, a couple of decades ago. And if you don't keep the balance in the system, you lose the pipeline of ideas that may seem absurdly abstract at this stage, which you can never tell what they will lead to in the future. I mean, I think that's true of all sorts of things. I mean, you think about the evolution of, the way that technologies that sort of become useful. I mean, game engines are a good example. A technology that has its roots in a whole bunch of mathematical modelling. I mean, really was probably a bunch of, strange mathematicians thinking strange thoughts that nobody else understood, turns into a technology which is then, revolutionary for one industry and is now being applied to 1,000 other fields. You can't predict some of this stuff, and you shouldn't try. So you've got to scatter your bread a little bit on the water. I think, though, in Patrick Vallance, who's been appointed as a science minister, we're in pretty good hands. Somebody who understands the balance. And I think that's great. It's a fantastic appointment.
Yeah, absolutely. I wanted to ask you finally a little bit about, and kind of getting back to the, the government relationship with the sector a bit. And I wanted to ask you a bit about the freedom of speech on campus. The bill, I think, has just come into effect. Am I right on that? But I wanted to ask how you thought Labor would manage that particular issue.
Just your point about the bill having come into effect, actually, there is a piece of sort of secondary legislation that will bring the powers conferred on the FS by the Freedom of Speech Act into effect on the 1st of August.
Mm-hmm.
And you might imagine that during the conversations that we're having with ministers in the first few weeks, we'll be saying, do you want to have a think about that? Because I think that legislation was produced in a climate in which freedom of speech was seen as a kind of absolute. And maybe, there are probably lots of people who think that is the way that it should be seen. I think having had a period now of 8 months of grappling with how you preserve the ability of people to express strongly held views, legitimately strongly held views on an extremely divisive subject, whilst maintaining the legitimate safety of staff and students who have a very different view of that topic. I think we've all learned a lot about how important it is to strike that balance and how difficult it is. I don't think the Freedom of Speech Act is going to help us with that challenge. In fact, I think it might make it worse, because there is a kind of now a legislative framework that makes it quite difficult for universities to apply a degree of judgment around especially when it comes to thinking about balancing their responsibilities in relation to freedom of speech with things like the public sector equality duty. And I think we just all need to take a step back and look at what we've learned over the course of the last several months and think about whether that legislation and the regulatory framework it brings into play is right and is helpful, or whether in fact it needs a bit of a rethink. My money is on put it in the rethink bucket, because I don't think it's going to help us.
Interesting. I want to end with a quote that you gave THE back in 2014. You said, you were speaking of your own student days, you said, "I've always felt that if you surround yourself with good people and listen hard, some of it rubs off." And I wondered, a decade on, do you think this is a good starting point for the new government?
It is. It is the most powerful. For me, this is a kind of a really powerful personal guide. It always has been. In fact, it's something my dad said to me when I was probably in my kind of mid-teens. I still think it's good advice. And I think that, there are lots of people who are going to feel a big weight on their shoulders of responsibility as they assume ministerial office. And I certainly feel that in the role that I have. The best way to discharge that responsibility well is by diligently listening to people with lots and lots of different opinions, but with experience and expertise. And you don't necessarily, you will never please everybody. You might not always get the decision right, but if you listen diligently to good people, you stand a better chance. And I think that's true of ministers, just as it's true for me personally.
I think that is a great place to end on, and a really fantastic quote. It definitely resonated with me. Thank you so much for your time today, Vivienne. It's been very interesting speaking with you.
It's my pleasure. Thank you for having me.
It's interesting that she obviously is really keen to see a bit of stability in the system, but also one of the themes that just comes through over and again is this idea that universities really need to frame themselves as being part of the solution, as being a vehicle by which government can achieve their goals and their policies. I think that is going to be really, really key to a kind of change in the dynamic and the relationship between government and universities.
Yeah, absolutely. And taking that longer term view about how the sector can really support those broader missions of the government. I like the fact that she saw the reset as a potential breath of fresh air, as you say, in higher education being seen as a partner rather than a problem. And also, she used the word tilt. to talk about balancing and so much balance between blue sky research, for instance, and applied, but also between that sort of give and take that goes between government and the sector. I really enjoyed speaking to her.
Yeah, and one thing actually that really stood out for me, the point she made that the university sector is the second biggest funder of research.
Yeah, that's what she said. I think 5.7 billion, it's massive.
Yeah, which is huge and definitely something that gets overlooked across the board, really, when talking about higher education. So I spoke to Chris Day, who is Vice-Chancellor of the University of Newcastle and current chair of the Russell Group of research-intensive universities, which are generally considered to be the UK's most prestigious institutions. It was really interesting to get Chris's perspective because as the leader of a UK institution, he is very much dealing with these challenges that we've been talking about on a day-to-day basis. You know, he's really at the coalface of this. And as a result, he didn't mince his words. He was pretty brutally honest about the fact that in the end, the major problem that needs addressing is financial. And until that is sorted, all the other kind of maybe challenges and issues that UK higher education is facing won't be solved. Hi Chris, thanks for joining us on the podcast.
Hi Miranda, good to talk to you.
We are chatting just under a week after our new Labour government was confirmed, and keen really to talk through what this might mean for higher education and what opportunities it may offer the sector. At the moment, it has to be said, we don't know a huge amount about what Labour may or may not do for universities. But from your experience, could this lack of detail potentially be an opportunity?
Yes, I think so. I mean, as you say, she wasn't a top priority in the campaign. There was no specific manifesto or pledges about tuition fees, student loans, and the like. However, they did allude to the current HE funding crisis, in which they described the current funding settlement does not work for the taxpayer university staff or students, and pledged to act to create a secure future for higher education. So I think with that sort of general sentiment expressed in their manifesto, one would imagine that they would be interested in thoughts of the sector and other observers about how they can improve the bizarre financial situation that we find ourselves in because of the funding situation. And obviously, as chair of the Russell Group and as a vice-chancellor of a Russell Group university, I would be very keen to help them in their thinking towards getting a more sustainable footing for what is such an important sector for the economy.
Yes, it does seem that UK universities are rather stuck between a rock and a hard place when it comes to their finances at the moment. So that's something I definitely want to go on to pick your brains on a bit more. But just quickly before we do, quick fire reactions to the little that we do know. So one of the things that they have also talked about is a closer integration of higher education with other forms of skills training. What are your thoughts on this?
Very positive. I mean, I think it's something that perhaps has been an underappreciated aspect of Russell Groups. I think there might be a view out there that sort of skills is for FEs and perhaps, post-92s types of universities, but most Russell Group universities already offer a whole variety of skills type options, including degree apprenticeships, lifelong learning, CPD. We're working really closely with partners in FE to maximise our respective strengths across the country. So very positive. Interestingly, the data would tell you that many of these opportunities, like apprenticeships, are actually declining in recent years in terms of the uptake. So the government, if they are keen on this, will have to establish a system that makes sure these programmes are properly funded, are attractive to students and employers, and are appropriate to the skills they're trying to promote and integrated. So we're very positive about it, but it doesn't quite work at the minute. And there are examples across the country, including in the Northeast, where the universities in the Northeast are working really closely with the FE colleges in things like electrification, life sciences, to try and produce that pyramid structure where you can get all different educational levels for those sectors. But it's not straightforward, but very positive about the idea of coordinated skills training.
Yeah, because previously it did seem that apprenticeships and more vocational, in inverted commas, skills were very much being pitted against universities and degrees, which seems to probably not be of great benefit to anyone. So another one, short-term funding cycles for research and development to be scrapped in favour of 10-year budgets.
Yes, on the surface of it, again, extremely welcome. The Russell Group's certainly been advocating for longer funding cycles for years to make the funding landscape more predictable and stable. That's for us ourselves to enable us to do that long-term planning. But of course, in terms of attracting additional funding, particularly from the commercial industrial sector, it gives them that confidence, doesn't it? If they know that some of the funding streams that they are matching and working with us on are likely to be in place, for that 10-year period. So I think it's both for us and for our partners, both, I guess, from the commercial sector, but also perhaps institutions like ours overseas. It gives them that confidence. I suppose the question mark, the concern is how this will be implemented. They've talked about 10-year funding settlements for key institutions. And, is that government-funded research institutions like the CRIC, or is it the university sector, or is it a bit of the sector? So I think it's important that we understand what they mean by this and what that settlement's for. And the other thing to say about it is a sort of just, not a warning, but just to make sure that within those 10-year budgets, we remain responsive and fleet of foot when needed. And I think a really good example, wouldn't it be how the R&D sector was able to respond very quickly during COVID-19? Money was poured into NIHR, Medical Research Council, to suddenly corral all of our efforts towards this, this global problem. And you wouldn't want all of the money to be tied up in these long-term deals that stopped them being able to move money around when it was needed. But I think other than those two potential risks, very positive about a 10-year budget cycle.
I can see the devil is in the detail there, and there is definitely a need for some flexibility in the way these things are approached. Away from that, what, in your view, do need to be the absolute first government priorities for UK higher education?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, Miranda, to look away from the HE funding crisis. I mean, we've seen recent data suggesting that, in this financial year, the university financial year, which ends at the end of July, it's been estimated that as much as 40% of this whole sector will be in deficit this year because of this combination of fixed home fees and difficulties, some self-induced, in recruiting international students. Added to the fact that we've always done research at a loss, you've got this perfect storm for a financial crisis hitting the sector with potential for institutional failures in the very near future. We've seen universities talking about job cuts, departmental closures. I think this is only the tip of the iceberg if something isn't done in the immediate future as a sort of finger in the dike approach, and then looking at a more long-term sustainable solution. So I think the funding crisis has to be centre of what they need to look at first, because if they do that, then of course that will allow us to do all the other things that we and they think are important. So maintaining the pipeline of skills to grow the economy, allowing us to carry out the world-leading research that addresses so many of their missions around economic growth, climate change, public service reform, etc., while at the same time giving our students the educational quality and choice that we want. So, it's a given that they're our main functions, but if we don't sort the first problem out, then we won't be able to do those main functions. I think if we think about the sort of customer, and I don't like describing students as customers, but just to use that term, because I think people know what we mean now that they're paying fees, of course. I suppose the Russell Group ask has always been, or has been for some time now, given the cost of living crisis affecting our students, something early on maintenance support, reintroduction of maintenance grants for the poorer students, because if, as we see, one of their 5 missions is of the new government is this sort of equity and fairness across society. Well, what better way to achieve some of that than by encouraging, the more disadvantaged students to come to universities like ours? If they're held back by financial barriers, then that becomes less likely. So I think there's a piece around making us sustainable, but there's another piece around making it financially feasible for poorer students to be able to come to our institutions and get those life opportunities that Labour parties have been talking about increasing as long as I can remember politics.
And you mentioned that you'd be very happy to work with the incumbent government on how exactly that might be framed. How would you go about doing that? I know that's a big question with a long answer.
It's a really good question. Of course, I think the first thing to say, certainly the Russell Group approach about this going forward is the sort of what can you do for your country sort of argument rather than what can it do for you, in that if for obvious reasons the main focus of the new government is on economic growth, because without that they can't do all the other things they want to do, then I think our starting point as a sector, but particularly in the research intensives, it has to be about making that case that of how we can contribute to economic growth through the skills, through the R&D that we do, both locally and in regional clusters, as is in their industrial strategy, or nationally and globally. So I think that will be our starting point. If you want these things, Labour government, this is how the university sector can contribute, how it is contributing, and how it can go on contributing. And I think then on top of that, of course, you can then make the argument, if you want world-leading research, if you want fantastic educational experiences, if you want us to be great anchor institutions building those clusters in the northeast and the southwest, etc., then we can't do that if we're running persistent deficits. So I think that will be the way around we make the case, which I think is the right way, and it's honest. I think in terms of what could you do now, I suspect they will be looking at a number of options. I mean, clearly there are only two places this extra money can come from, really. It's either got to come from increased fees with something done about how they are paid back to make that more progressive and fairer, or it's an increase in the teaching grants, which is obviously what was cut so drastically back in the noughties when the student fees were brought in. And I suspect they will be looking at things like certainly linking student fees from now on to inflation, which was always in the Joe Johnson proposal, and of course means that at least it won't get worse, because the problem at the moment is, as you're aware, we've had flat funding now in the fee section since 2017, so it hasn't even gone up with inflation. So I think that would be a fairly uncontroversial no-brainer for me, that you just link the current fee to inflation going forward, so we stop the bleeding of our real-term resource. I think perhaps more controversially, but I can see it being acceptable, would be a small uplift in the student fee. I mean, we have calculated, if you simply put the 9,250 up to but by £500 to 9,750, keeping it under that sort of 10,000 barrier, average Russell Group, that would be about £6.5–7 million extra income a year. Now that doesn't sound a great deal, but if you then link that with inflation, that would turn some small deficits at Russell Group universities, and certainly outside the Russell Group, into small surpluses, and you could at least start to put that finger in the dike. And I think that would be a really welcome early move that says, we understand your pain, we'll give you a sort of short-term fix that will at least help the current situation, won't burden the students too much. We can help the students, the poorer students, with something around maintenance, while we have a proper real look at how we fund our higher education system and get something going forward that works for as they say in their manifesto, that works better for the taxpayer, for the student, for the institutions.
Yes, and as you say, it may not sound like huge amounts, but a surplus is a surplus and a deficit is a deficit.
The only difference between universities and how they're dealing with that deficit and how obviously one is the size of the deficits that they're reporting in their OFS reports, but obviously your ability to deal with that will depend on your reserves, and some universities could probably deal with small deficit budgets for a few years and carry that while hopefully things get better. Others can't. If you don't have that cash in the bank and then you're running into deficits and your banks start calling in covenants, etc., that's when you can see the snowballing effect, that you start to get institutional failure. And of course, once you start getting institutional failure, do the banking sector, for example, in general, get nervous about universities? And you could see the whole thing sort of suddenly spiraling downwards, which is what, if I was Bridget Phillipson and Treasury, I'd want to do something quick that stops that happening, while I work out, in the long term, how I'm going to stop this happening over the next decade or so, rather than in the next 18 months.
Yes, and that's interesting that you've referenced the danger of a university going bankrupt, because there has been a lot of talk about the risk of this. Labour have indicated that they wish to be a friend to universities, and that they would move to secure the future of the sector and prevent a university going under. But it's interesting, because I would assume that this is a lot less of a risk for Russell Group institutions than some others. But the fact that, as you point out, it would potentially be detrimental for the whole sector.
Yeah, absolutely. And and just to be clear, the Russell Group universities are not immune to this. And in that OFS report, with the 40% institutions facing deficits, there are many, many Russell Groups, including our own, in that. Because paradoxically, of course, although they're, in financial terms, they tend to be bigger. I mean, we're one of the smaller Russell Groups, and our turnovers, well over 600 million. You've got several of the Russell Group, in the billion plus turnover. But of course, paradoxically, because a lot of that income is research, and we make a loss on all research, even publicly funded research, apart from a little bit of commercial research where we might recoup, full costs and a bit more. In a way, that extra turnover that comes from being a big research powerhouse creates further problems, because you've got to subsidise the gap there, as well as a more teaching-focused institution that's having to subsidise the gap and the loss on home student teaching, whereas the Russell Group have that problem, but also the research subsidy. So in a way, the Russell Groups are bigger and bolder, if you like, and do lots more research, but that makes them even more vulnerable to some extent. We've already had discussions at the Russell Group about, who's going to be the first Russell Group that starts to turn down research grants because we can't afford the subsidy that we know we're going to find. And, that discussion has started to happen. It may well have already happened. One thinks particularly of, medical charity grants, which are so important for the likes of the Russell Group, with the big medical schools, etc. Of course, because they come with even less full economic costs, you're doing them at a bigger loss. Are we getting to a time where a smaller Russell Group will say to CR UK, Wellcome Trust, we can't take that funding because we can't afford the subsidy? And I think, given how we are so proud of our research intensivity and our global position as research powerhouses, that, again, that would be a really sad unintended consequence of the current funding crisis, that we simply can't afford to do world-leading research.
Yeah, that's deeply worrying, and a very good point to make. Given what we know of this new government and the ministers that have been selected to oversee areas that interact with higher education, but also the undoubted resistance to raising tuition fees, I think it's been described by Bridget Phillipson as unpalatable, although she has not ruled it out. But where should UK universities be focusing their efforts to try and drive revenue and maybe policy impact? I mean, you say research at the moment is a loss leader, but a spin out's an area where we can expand, now that we have a government who's potentially friendlier to international students. Could that be a renewed focus? It's just, where can universities turn?
Yes. I mean, the short answer is the only thing that we consistently make any surplus on to provide these subsidies is international students. I mean, just to be very clear, that is absolutely across the sector. The only thing we do in any sort of volume where we make a margin that allows us to function. And therefore, I would be very positive about the change in rhetoric already that we've seen in the last week or so, and we saw in the work up to the election. We have a new government that seems to be positive about the benefits of international students, the cultural, the financial benefits that they bring, the soft power. We could talk about that for hours. So the first piece of good news is at least the noise has stopped for a while, and about trying to, quotes, do something about, international student migration. So we have Russell Group universities now, just to be clear, that bring in more than 50% of their fee income is from international students, more than 50%, some as high as 60%. So that's how dependent we are in our major research-intensive universities on international students. And doing something to replace that is almost impossible to imagine because of the huge size relative to our budgets that represents. So that's the first thing, that we have to make sure that everybody is clear about the benefit of international students, that we talk them up, this fantastic export for the country, the benefits it brings. And by the way, it's also allowing us to afford to teach home students and do our research. Your question, though, is, are there other things that we can do? And, the recent spin out review was extremely encouraging, because I think until that review, there was a sort of perception, wasn't there, that the UK was not as good at this as other countries, particularly, obviously, United States, and one thinks, about California and the Silicon Valley, etc. But what that report showed was that actually we do pretty well. It's just a volume thing, that we're just not the same size as them. But if you look at the success of the percentage success of our spin outs, the job creation, the turnover, it's as good as anywhere. So I think we are good at this. There are issues with it, such as the ability to get that follow-on medium-sized funding that allows those spin-outs to become, SMEs and gross, and that's certainly something the Russell Group has been calling for help with from the government. What I would say is, in my experience, at Newcastle, and I'm not an Oxford or an Imperial, it is very rare to make serious amounts of money from these things. I mean, you often have a bit of equity left in the company, and that eventually, if they were ever sold on, or you were able to sell your shares in a hugely expensive, hugely high turnover business, you might see some investment. I think we made over 3 or 4 million once in my time from a company that spun out and produced a cancer drug, and that was more through a licensing deal than actually a spin out company. So I think this is a really beneficial thing for the economy, for universities to be doing, creating exciting new tech-savvy companies that drive forward the economy. I don't think it's a way of solving the university financial problem, sadly.
Yeah, so maybe it forms more of the case to make to government for funding universities properly, but it won't in and of itself provide that funding.
That's exactly the point.
One thing, I read a very interesting interview with Nancy Rothwell upon her departure from the University of Manchester, and she refers to federated provision as being a potential way for universities to manage basically shrinking resources. So, different universities offering different elements of courses. What are your thoughts on this?
As always, Nancy has great and very sensible thoughts about the sector. I think that, to me, would be something that would naturally arise if you were looking at institutional failure. I think that's what you might see first. If you look at the Northeast, there's effectively 2 Russell Groups, ourselves and Durham, and then you've got the 3 large post-92, Sunderland, Teesside and Northumbria. If there were to be a failure in the Northeast, you might look to say, well, rather than let them just fail with all of the job losses and the economic effects that would have on those regions, could the other 4, let's just say that the other 4 are not in that state, come in to help by running joint courses, sharing back office functions, procurement, etc. So I think those sort of innovative ways of working may well be forced upon the sector, and I think that's I think where I could see that happening. Could I see that happening proactively without being forced by a crisis? I'm not sure. I mean, we've certainly started to look at, with our very local university, I mean, it's literally 500 yards away, Northumbria University, as to whether it might be sensible at some time to do some back office stuff, together, joint HR, joint finance, etc. And we're nowhere near that yet. But of course, those questions are being asked as we look ahead into the abyss, which is continuing flat home fees, governments being negative about international students, not many other obvious sources of income. These are forcing institutions of all types to start and think creatively, because that's what we do, isn't it? We do creation, we do innovation, and we're having to apply those skills to our own businesses. And that definitely includes working with near neighbours on delivery of back office and indeed front office functions.
Yeah, problem solving in the extreme.
Yes.
Let's move on to maybe a more optimistic focus. What do you think about the appointments of Jackie Smith and Sir Patrick Vallance? Are these reasons for celebration?
Yes, simply yes. I mean, perhaps I'll talk about the one that I understand the most as a career academic clinician. I know Patrick reasonably well. Obviously, the fact that he has a background in my old world of academic medicine, when he was head of the Division of Medicine at UCL, then in industry where he went to GSK, and then now in government as the CSA. I mean, one difficult to think, isn't it, of somebody who's better qualified to really take on the science brief. And of course, by being the CSA, that broadened his experience outside life sciences and medicine as well. So, he's perfectly capable of dealing with data, AI, climate change, etc. I think it signals a really positive message from this government that they're taking science extremely seriously. Jackie, I know less about. What is clear is she's very experienced, again, in and outside government. She's been Home Secretary. She has delivered government portfolios before. So again, it sends a signal to me, giving her that FE and HE brief, that they are really serious about this. So cautiously very positive about both appointments.
Good. And we definitely saw in the previous sort of decade a bit of a war on experts. That does not seem to be the perspective of this new government, given, Sir Patrick Vallance as a good example of one of their appointments. On that basis, do you think there might be a bigger role for academics to work alongside this new administration? And if so, what might that be? How might that look?
I guess it comes down to that naive belief that about how evidence would be used in policy making, isn't it? And as you say, with someone like Patrick at the helm, you would imagine that you might see more of that. I mean, policy certainly in the last few years, a lot of it seems to have been made up on the hoof, and I'm absolutely cognizant of the fact that sometimes, the facts say this, but policy has to say something else because of politics, public opinion, whatever. You can't always have every single policy determined by hard evidence, but one would imagine that at the start of a new government with these type of appointments, that they would be looking to have more evidence-based policies, and where better to look for many of these things than universities that are full of people who've spent their lives working on these important areas. And if you look at their priorities that they've stated, yes, of course, there's economic growth, which we can talk about, but improving public service efficiency, helping deliver NHS workforce, supporting efforts to achieve net zero, etc. All of those things, our universities are stuffed full of experts who understand those sectors extremely well. And and Patrick obviously knows all about the Chief Science Advisor network. He managed the governmental chief science advisors in the various departments, who are all card-carrying academics, either now or in the past. So I would imagine that network and through those CSAs reaching out into the academic community to bolster those areas of expertise, one would hope that sort of currently well-established formal way of seeking evidence from experts, including many from the university sector, would go into overdrive. And I think that would give universities, but the public, a lot of comfort, knowing that hopefully many of the decisions that they're subjected to have come from hard evidence. And in terms of the Russell Group, we'll do what we've always done, Miranda, which is to interact as much as we can with the ministers, their advisors, the civil servants, offering our support and our assistance.
What do you think this new government might mean for university industrial relations? These have been tempestuous in the last couple of years. As a university leader, do you have any insight on how to look for outcomes that will satisfy the institutional, staff and indeed student needs?
It's a tough question, Miranda, because effectively it all boils down to money at the end of the day, doesn't it? I mean, the reason that universities haven't been able to for example, give staff the pay rises that they quite rightly want, given how their real pay has fallen over several years, how important they are to the economy, is because of the financial state of the sector. And until that is fixed, it may well be that Labour governments are traditionally more supportive of, if you like, quotes, the workers, close quotes. But the fact is, unless we have more money in the system, we can't give those workers the pay, and in some cases the conditions and the flexible pay spines and the better work, all of the things that they want are dependent on the sector having more money in the bank that can do that. And the reason that we've been offering relatively low pay awards is because that's within the only thing we can do within the affordability. And it doesn't matter which colour of government is in power, until that is addressed, I think we will go on having difficult relations.
So the first thing that needs to be addressed is this pressing question of funding. I mean, to wrap up,
yeah,
as Vice-Chancellor, does the change of government make any immediate difference to your approach to running the University of Newcastle, or indeed to decision making looking ahead?
I guess the most obvious change, Miranda, again, just from their manifesto, their sort of pre-election comments from people like Bridget Phillipson and Peter Kyle and others, is just this taking away the feeling that somehow the university sector was a bad thing. I think we definitely become a bit like the enemy, really. Whether it was low value degrees, whether it was our effect on immigration. It just seemed to be every week there was some negative story appearing in newspapers and on the media, often emanating from government comments about the sector. And I think it just felt, being a university leader for the past 8 years, that you're sort of permanently under the cosh, really, from the normal things you'd expect, the economics, the world situations, Brexit, COVID, etc. But when your own government seemed to be continually nitpicking at the sector about various things, it just felt a bit besieged. And I think that the immediate effect, certainly from their initial statements and comments, has just been taking that away. I mean, they've made no promises yet. As you say, they've not said they're going to raise fees or give us a bigger teaching grant or suddenly fund research at 100% costs, and all the things, of course, we, to some extent, would be marvelous. But they've just stopped bashing us, and they've said positive things about the sector and how it could be the centre, or is the centre, of plans for economic growth in the regions and in the country. And so I think I can't really get across to you how different, even within a week or so, that feels. You suddenly feel you're back again in a sector that's seen as part of the solution, to be worked with, and that just feels different.
The power of positivity. So let's hope for the sector that those feelings are followed up with actions that match them.
Yes.
Great to talk to you today, Chris. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts at this early stage of the new government.
I took a lot from that conversation that you had, Miranda, with Chris Day. I thought it was interesting that, like Vivienne, he asked what universities can contribute to economic growth regionally, nationally and globally. And more on finance, it all comes back to money, doesn't it? The sector's stark reliance on international students, but not just for revenue, which is often how we speak about them, but for cultural exchange and soft power, and how actually difficult it would be to find a replacement for that revenue stream. So that spin-outs, which are often touted as being ways to generate more revenue, are a glimmer of hope, but actually, in terms of the general economy and job creation, not a complete solution. So many things to think about here.
I think in the end, the change that Chris feels in the atmosphere was palpable. Vivienne also alluded to this feeling across the sector that, finally they might be seen as there to offer their assistance, to be a force for good. And actually, I really, really hope that turns out to be the case, because this is one of the UK's greatest exports, but also it's education. That is a force for good in almost any context. So what a wonderful thing to be known for as a country, that you've got this amazing higher education sector, and how very sad it would be really to let that slide, and you get what you pay for. So if we don't look after it, we'll lose it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I hope, Vivienne's quote, as I said in the interview, really resonated with me, which is surround yourself with good people and listen to them. And this seems to be kind of the essence of education. So hopefully that is what we'll see happening. Well, on that note, I think we'll say thank you very much for listening to the Campus Podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe. And for more resources on all aspects of higher education, you can visit timeshighereducation.com/campus. We'll see you next time.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.